to be learning today. Oh, hi, Tammy Wang, also here. Cool, instructional coaches. Um, so we're very excited. We're here for session 3 of Accelerating Learning for Heritage Speakers from Theory to Practice. And today we'll be learning from Nancy Domínguez-Fret, Doctora, from Northern Illinois University. And I am going to move this. And I put in the chat the Jamboard from our last 2 sessions. You can kind of peruse the work that we've done. And we will, if you leave that open, that'll be great because we'll go to frames 1 and 2 later. Okay. Everyone should have, oh, okay. I'll check that. Yeah. So welcome. So this is today. We're getting started reconnecting as a community, reminding you of our resource folder that is linked, and I will put it in the chat. And basically, right now we have all the resources from session 1 with Dr. Potowski. There's always Google Slides that I introduce everything, the links to the CTLE forms, things like that. That is there. And then session 2, and then we will add in the slides from today. And then our Jamboard is here. And then it's really exciting. We'll talk more about your cohort 2, right? We have a group of schools, 6 schools, open programs this past fall. And we've created a lot of resources as a group. And it's been like a real great sharing. So, and Nancy has really culled and cultivated a lot of resources, articles and things like that. So you'll have access to the whole Google Drive folder with all of these resources. And MS 158 friends, we're definitely learning more, getting more resources for Mandarin for heritage speakers. So it's really exciting to work with you on that. And so then I'll stop talking soon and we'll hear from Nancy about testimonios in the heritage language classroom. I think we need to think of a way to define these identity projects in Mandarin. So we'll talk about that. And then looking ahead, Nancy will be available for coaching. There's a Calendly link where you will have time to meet with her and really think through what this looks like in your specific school context. And then our last session is next Wednesday. And this is our work together, right? So just want to, you've seen these slides before. You're joining this effort, right? Part of the second cohort of schools. And again, you'll sign up for coaching with Nancy. And today, and then next week, we'll talk more about curriculum. For Spanish speakers courses, we will recommend Galería de Lengua y Cultura from Vista Higher Learning. That is currently available on Shop DOE. And that is the program that I can put this all in an email. I'll link it in for you. And I can set up an info session with the vendor and our contact Layla there. That's what we're using with the cohort 1 schools. We've learned a lot throughout the year. There's some really rich text. You'll see some examples in Nancy's slides today. And we've created those additional resources to support you in using it. And then for our colleagues from MS 158, let's schedule some time to learn more about what you have in place for Mandarin already, additional resources that we can find from our partners. Nancy's been great and already connected me with some folks focusing on Mandarin heritage. At this time, New York City Public Schools, we haven't found there's no perfect curriculum, right? But a heritage curriculum for Mandarin from any publisher. So we will work together on that. And then planning sessions over the summer, right? Certainly can provide CTLE. There's a hope for per session, but as always, any per session activity is pending budget. So I'll let you know when that goes through. In any case, I would like in August to come together. And it's really powerful in person. The planning we were doing with the actual purple books, really digging into those. And we zoomed in, Nancy. I don't know where you were last August, but we zoomed you in for some expert support over the summer when we were planning for September. And then we'll continue over next year, monthly sessions, Zoom sessions to really talk through how it's going, adjustments, share resources, things like that. So that's the work ahead. And oh, this one piece too, reviewing student work, May to June, right? So I'll share more about sort of assessments you can give, but it's really important thinking about Kim's work and the activity, thinking of plant levels for students to get a full sense of the students' proficiency in different modes, right? Hopefully they're stronger in conversation so they can have academic discussions in Spanish or Mandarin. And then from there, we work on literacy skills, things like that. And Nancy will give you guidance on how to choose students, assess things like that. And here we are in the third one. And really, this is the practical piece. Nancy is so experienced working with teachers as a teacher prep programs at college and high school to really bring this to life for students. So here's Nancy. So we're going to hear from her in a minute. And I need to read again this amazing publication from English language learner to Spanish teacher. We all know that we have a real shortage of language teachers, and it's crazy, una locura, that in New York City we don't have enough Spanish teachers, but we would really want our students to be the next generation of students getting the seal of biliteracy, the language teachers, things like that. So amazing. And then, okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. Before I turn it over to Nancy, and we're reconnecting and you have the Jamboard open, hopefully I'll put in the chat again. Anyone like to share anything after session 2, any conversations you've had with students or anything top of mind right now as we get ready to learn from Nancy? No, you have great questions. We'll continue to add things on here, right? I will refer you to the parking lot. If something comes up, Nancy will present. There will be time for questions and answers, but if you have any burning questions, please do add them to frame 5 of the Jamboard, okay? I'll stop sharing and give it to Nancy.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think I need access to share.
Oh, I made you co-host. You should be able to. Oh, are you on 2? Okay, I'm sorry.
No,
you should. Yeah, apologies.
That's fine. And you guys can see my slides now, right?
Okay. Yes. Not your email. Okay, good.
I think that has happened to everyone, especially during Zoom. I mean, during the pandemic, I'm sure we all had really interesting things happen to us.
Yep.
So thank you once again for having me here. My name is Nancy Domínguez-Fret, and I am going to share some of my own testimonio and talk a little bit about what testimonios are and how you can use them in your own heritage language classroom, whether it's Spanish, Mandarin, or really any heritage language that you teach. My area of expertise is Spanish, but I will try to bridge in as much as possible with make connections with Mandarin as well too. And I'm happy to answer any questions or anything like that during the session as well. So the title is Lessons Learned, Best Practices from the SHL Classroom. And really it is like the lessons that I've learned throughout the years teaching heritage Spanish at the high school level, at the college level, and then engaging in research as well and working with practitioners. So first of all, how are you feeling today? I definitely use Google Translate for Mandarin, so I apologize if it's not correct, but if you can just type in the chat based on the koala scale, how are you feeling today? We have some 5s, 4, a 7. 4, 6. Okay. I think we're all getting there, right? Like we want it to be the end of the school year. We're tired. We're getting to that point. Thank you for sharing. One more, another 5. Okay. Bien. Thank you. It's always good to, I know it's a little silly, but to ask students just so you can kind of get an idea, right? Like how they're doing, how they're feeling. We got a 1 and a 3 now as well too, and kind of read the room a little bit. So for today, these are sort of the learning goals, understanding what are some of the best practices for the heritage language classroom, being able to identify and value our students' cultural and linguistic funds of knowledge, and we'll talk about what that term means. And then also understanding what a testimonio is and how I can use it as a tool for learning in our heritage language classrooms. So I will start by sharing a little bit about my own testimonio and how I engaged in this work. So I was born and raised in Chicago. I grew up in La Villita. I don't know if any of you guys have ever visited La Villita in Chicago, but it's a microcosm of Mexico. It's like 97% Mexican community. So therefore, I grew up speaking Spanish, not only at home, but also with my neighbors, listening to music in Spanish, using Spanish really to purchase things around my community. And then I also used Spanish in school until I was in fifth grade when I was transitioned out of my transitional bilingual program. I was like in a late exit bilingual program. So I really, as a child, loved Spanish, had really positive experiences with Spanish, and really identified, with my Mexican background and roots. And I traveled quite a lot to Mexico. So I felt really, really confident in my Spanish, and I used it a lot in school. But then when I exited the bilingual program, I really didn't use it in school anymore, even though I was still in the same barrio, right? Like it was still a Spanish speaking community. We stopped using it completely in school because I was now in a monolingual English classroom. And then I didn't use it again in a school setting until my junior year in high school. So there was like a big gap there, right? I still used it at home, but academically, I didn't practice my reading or writing anymore. And then when I started taking those classes at the high school level, the first book that was given to me was to read Don Quixote de la Mancha. And I was like really, really, I felt like really linguistically, like my linguistic security went down, right, a lot, because I was like, I don't understand the book, I don't understand the Spanish, and I don't speak the right Spanish, right? So like all these things were going through my mind. But I decided that I needed to do something, right, to perfect whatever that means, my Spanish. So I decided to become a Spanish teacher. And the reason why I share the Don Quixote de la Mancha book anecdote is because that book shouldn't be the first book that heritage speakers should see, right? And as freshmen or sophomores or juniors or seniors, really, it's kind of like a college level book. So it's not that it's not an important book. You can read it later on once you build those literacy skills, but it's a really hard book and not relatable, right? To my lived experiences, it wasn't. So it discouraged me a little bit, but then I'm like, you know what? No, I need to figure out how to understand this book if that's the goal, or this type of Spanish. How do you speak this type of Spanish, even though it's not necessarily the truth, right? The Spanish that we're speaking today. But anyway, I decided to become a Spanish teacher, and then I did my BA at UIC, and then I learned how to teach Spanish as a second language. But little did I know that after grad school, I was offered a job to teach Spanish as a heritage language. It was 3 levels. So I said, oh, well, it's probably almost the same thing. At this point, I didn't know what was the difference, right? Because heritage classes 10 years ago, 12 years ago, were not that common. So I started teaching, and I had no idea what I was doing, right? And I felt guilty that I was teaching my students that, were a reflection of myself in a way that was probably not asset-based, right? Like I was trying to kind of do the same thing that was done to me, correcting them, saying, no se dice aiga, se dice allá, and just trying to figure out, how to teach them without having any preparation. So I decided to go back to school and really learn how to teach heritage, and started going to conferences and trying to figure out how can I teach my students in a way that they're going to see themselves reflected, and that they're not going to feel that I am correcting them or trying to fix their Spanish. And here I am today, right? But I went and did my PhD at UIC and focused really on teacher education. So I wanted to capture the stories of individuals like myself. I don't know if any of you are also heritage speakers of Spanish or heritage speakers of a language, and really understand why they decided to become Spanish teachers, and how their experiences as heritage speakers across the educational pipeline influences how they teach Spanish, right? So like if they were corrected because they spoke Spanish, or punished because they spoke Spanish, or corrected because they spoke the quote unquote wrong type of Spanish, do they do that to their students, or do they figure out other ways to help them maintain their language? So that was sort of my dissertation research. But I also am really invested in this work because I'm the mother of 2 Mexican Rican children. My husband is actually from the Bronx. So it's really cool to kind of go full circle and be with you guys here today, even though it's on Zoom. So I'm raising two Mexican children. I really want them to have access to these classes later on, right? To be able to maintain their heritage language. So I'm coming in from sort of different angles and really excited to do this work. So in our household, my kids listen to Mexican Spanish, Puerto Rican Spanish, and Spanglish and English, right? So they're engaging in different language practices. And I also wanted to share that it was not until grad school that I began to learn how to teach heritage language classes. And these are some of the books that sort of informed my teaching practices and really helped me learn more about my culture, learn more about critical approaches to teaching languages, transitioning from asset-based to critical approaches. And it has kind of formed some of the practices and lessons that I will share with you today based on my experiences. So just really quickly, when I was hired at Bolingbrook High School, in the school that I didn't know what I was doing in the beginning, I did have a really helpful chair of the department, and she helped me go to different conferences and gain knowledge, right, on how to teach these courses. And we even had a consultant come help us. And we were able to build 4 different levels of Heritage Spanish throughout 3 years, right? So 1 level each year, basically. Or in 1 year we did 2 levels, but I show you books here because these are some of the books that we use throughout the levels. And if you notice, the first book for Heritage Spanish 1, which was mostly for receptive bilinguals, that book, I don't know if you guys probably have all read it or read at least some of the chapters in that book. It's actually from, the author's from Chicago. So it's really cool that we were able to use a book, but there's excerpts, right? They're really short chapters. So we were able to tie it into students' identities. And most of our students in that first class were receptive bilinguals, meaning that they only really understood and produced very little language. So this book really helped us get them to talk about themes that they were familiar with. And then Cajas de Cartón, which maybe some of you guys have also used in your classrooms or read, is more about the life of a migrant farm worker and immigration. So that's like the book that we use with the Heritage 2 level, talking more about themes that didn't necessarily just impact them directly, but also their communities, and then moved on to, books like En el Tiempo de las Mariposas for Heritage 3, which is longer, and talking about dictatorships, right? And then Heritage 4, La Travesía de Enrique, which is about immigration, but it's also a longer book. So building on those literacy skills as well too, right? Like not giving them La Travesía de Enrique for the first class and then scaring them away from the class, but little by little finding books or excerpts of books where they can see themselves reflected and where they can, be engaged and want and desire to continue on the levels, because in our school, they didn't have to take all the levels, but a lot of them did. So that's a little bit of my high school experience. And I've also taught at the college level at College of DuPage and now Northern Illinois University. And these are some of the themes that we talk about in those classes, like la identidad, la inmigración y el movimiento chicano are some of the themes. So if at any point you're interested in any of these topics, I have developed units and stuff, and I can share the lessons with all of you if you need any of those resources. And this book is an open resource book. So I believe if you click on the link, you can have access to the entire book, and all the activities are included there as well. So I'll get started with what a testimonio is and why testimonios are so important in heritage language classrooms. So testimonios are a research method. There is rooted in Latin American studies, and it was used and it continues to be used as a social justice tool to document the experiences of marginalized communities, denouncing human rights violations, for example, survivors of civil wars or survivors of domestic violence, right? Documenting their stories to make this call for social action. So that's where they're rooted, and also in indigenous practices. And later on, like the 2000s, the use of testimonio was extended to other fields like education, which is the field that I did my PhD in. So the definition that I use for testimonios is this idea where individuals through testimonios are given the opportunity to retrieve their papelitos guardados, so silence or unrecounted experiences, and open and share them through a narrative that conveys personal, political, and social realities, right? So for example, when I wrote my testimonio for my PhD, I wrote about why I'm here, right? Like why I got a PhD, how I noticed that there weren't many heritage speakers that were heritage Spanish teachers, honestly. And even when we were there, we were not prepared to serve our own communities. And that's not okay, prioritizing second language acquisition over heritage language acquisition is not okay, right? So that's kind of part of my testimony and why I do this work. So engaging students and having that opportunity to also think about, oh, like in elementary school, I wasn't allowed to use Spanish in the classroom, and that was not okay, right? Like being like just really having these moments of reflecting on language and how that connects to our society and what we prioritize and how that influences their linguistic choices as well. So testimonials really give us an opportunity to reflect and make meaning of our educational experiences and use that to make a call for social action. So I will kind of walk you through excerpts of testimonials, but I also want to encourage you to start thinking about your own testimonial. Like, where did you grow up? What programs were you in elementary school? Were they transitional bilingual? Were they all monolingual? Were you in the sink or swim method? Were you corrected with English or Spanish? Does that influence how you teach languages? And really start reflecting on that. I don't know if I could have a volunteer to read this quote from Gloria Anzaldúa, which captures a little bit of her testimonial. I don't know if there's a volunteer that wants to read, so I don't have to keep hearing my voice.
I can read it.
Thank you, Melissa.
Chicanos who grew up speaking Chicano Spanish have internalized the belief that we speak poor Spanish. It is illegitimate, a bastard language. We use our language differences against each other. Repeated attacks on our native tongue diminish our sense of self. So if you want to really hurt me, talk badly about my language. Ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language.
Thank you. How do we interpret this quote and this sort of snapshot of Gloria Anzaldúa's testimonial? You can write on the chat or just unmute your microphone. Like, what does this text mean?
Sean tímidos.
Yeah, I think I can definitely relate to her. I'm Dominican, and there's definitely a lot of instances where people will say, like, oh, I can tell you're Dominican by the way that you use Spanish, that I don't speak it formally or it doesn't sound well. So, it definitely hurts me and like my identity as well to think that the Spanish that I speak isn't Spanish enough or isn't formal enough for others who hear when I speak or when other Dominicans speak.
Thank you, Melissa, for sharing some part of your testimony, right? Like your own lived experiences. That's so real, especially with Dominican, Puerto Rican, and a Caribbean variety of Spanish. Like it's always, that's my husband doesn't speak Spanish to my kids because of that, because he's like, oh no, it's like even though he lives with me, he's like, oh, Puerto Rican Spanish is like, you speak to them in Mexican Spanish because I don't want to mess them up. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like they have to hear both, right? So like it's like so ingrained in people that there's a specific language variety that's worth more, and that's not linguistically, that there's no science that backs that up, right? It's more like our beliefs and our ideologies. So thank you for sharing that. And my next question is, do we think that Gloria Anzaldúa just woke up one day and wrote this, or do we think that she experienced something that made her write these words, this testimonial?
I think she's probably, sorry, oh, my voice. I think she's probably experienced it multiple times. I mean, I imagine that it's like a collected experience from time, like from the beginning of when she started. Like it's sometimes, yes, sometimes something does happen and you wake up and you say like this happened to me. But a lot of the times, like when these experiences happen, it collects from childhood all the way to adulthood a lot of the times.
Thank you, Tammy, for sharing. And Karina, thank you for sharing on the chat as well, too. And you're right, like it's something that built up, right? Like she didn't just come, like in her adulthood, decide to write about this. I'm going to let you guys read a little excerpt from How to Tame a Wild Tongue, the chapter 1 in her book titled Borderlands. And I can also share this, Jill, if anyone's interested in reading the entire chapter. Is there another volunteer that would be willing to read these two short?
Sure, I'll read it.
Thank you. Good.
I remember being caught speaking Spanish at recess. That was good for 3 licks on the knuckles with a sharp ruler. I remember being sent to the corner of the classroom for talking back to the Anglo teacher when all I was trying to do was tell her how to pronounce my name. If you want to be American, speak American. If you don't like it, go back to Mexico where you belong. I want you to speak English. Para hallar buen trabajo, tienes que saber hablar el inglés bien. ¿Qué vale toda tu educación si todavía hablas inglés con un accent? My mother would say, mortified that I spoke English like a Mexican. At Pan American University, I and all Chicano students were required to take 2 speech classes. Their purpose, to get rid of our accents.
Thank you, Karina. And this was like around the 50s, 60s, right? So like she definitely endured linguistic and even corporal punishment, or linguistic discrimination and corporal punishment for speaking Spanish in school in the borderlands, right? So like very common to happen. So this is from Ansaldua's testimonio. And then if someone can read this short testimonio of Serena as well.
You can read.
Thank you.
Chinglish is not, it's not just English with mistakes. Growing up, I had a complicated relationship. Sorry, I have music, sorry. A complicated relationship with language. Since my parents didn't speak English to me before I started preschool, I had to learn English through immersion there. I spent much of my childhood perfecting my English and neglecting my Chinese. As I got older, I was always embarrassed about my Chinese. I wasn't a star student in weekend Chinese school classes. I speak with a Taiwanese accent that people from China always comment on. By the time I started taking Chinese classes at Yale, I was used to speaking in a mix of Chinese and English, Chinglish, that I found it hard to speak only Chinese. For example, I once asked my mom if we could, suo a gao of laundry, literally do a load of laundry. When I did try to speak Chinese in class, I was repeatedly told my Chinese was wrong. My teacher constantly corrected my Taiwanese accent and my English influenced sentence structure.
Thank you. So I just want you guys to think if you see similarities and differences across languages, right? These are both heritage speakers. And if you're interested, I think that I linked this, it's a blog to this slide as well. And also like thinking about identity and this idea of being corrected and feeling not Chinese enough or Mexican enough or Puerto Rican or Dominican enough. There's also this dissertation that someone wrote about, are you Chinese enough? And then more testimonials there as well. It's like a 100-page document that I can also send your way if you are interested in like looking more into that. But these ideas, right, these experiences are across different heritage languages, right? And I want you to just take a moment to think about what did we learn from reading an excerpt from Gloria and Serena's testimonio. As educators, is this information like this, little piece of their stories and helpful when thinking about planning and curriculum? If someone can just share what they think, and then either in the chat or just you can unmute yourself. Right, Raquel?
I think what you learn is that every kid has a background, and it's really easy to stereotype and bring our own biases into the classroom and our own expectations of how kids should sound. I think if you think about it, for me as a Spanish and E&L teacher, the one thing that frustrates me is when kids allow teachers to mispronounce their names, because I think that's the first step in you losing your heritage. So I always think of Asian students that Americanize their names because they don't want the teachers to mispronounce their names. And our kids that will say, no, don't call me Raquel, you can say Rachel. And it's like that simple step of you taking away from the child's heritage and the meaning of their name goes to the next step of we want you to all sound the same. Because it's interesting, in an English class, you never hear the mentioning of an accent. And those of us that live in New York know every borough has a different accent. But it's incredible, in a native language class, we want everyone to sound uniformed and robotic. And I always wonder why.
Thank you for sharing.
Not in your classrooms. Yours are going to be the richest places in the school with like all these amazing variaciones lexicas and all the different ways they say it if they're from Taiwan or Hong Kong or mainland China. Like depending where they're from, they're going to say things differently and it's going to be beautiful.
And just to kind of build up on what Raquel said, this idea of like, you know, monolingual language ideologies, first of all, right, in the US, they're deeply embedded, right? Like nationalist ideologies, like we speak English in the US, it's our language, even though it's not our official language, right? But also the standard language ideology, right? That there's only one specific way of speaking Spanish and we have to speak it that way, right? It's an ideology, like we all speak differently and there's different varieties of Spanish and they're equally valuable, right? So start thinking about, especially in New York, right? You guys have such linguistic and cultural diversity compared to Chicago, although that's changing for us slowly but surely. But you know, making sure that all of our students, that your Dominican students, that your Puerto Rican students never question the validity of their Spanish is really important, right? Because their Spanish is beautiful and it's just as valid. But corporal punishment was real, right? Like, and it happened, and that impacted why if parents decided to teach their next generation Spanish or not, right? And then we see like kind of the product of that today, right? Especially individuals that live in the borderlands in California, legislation has impacted whether our students maintain our language or not. So we really have to question that and not just blame parents, like parents didn't teach their children. Well, why didn't they teach their children? Some parents, right? Or like what legislations or policies were in place to help students maintain their heritage language is also really important. So these are just examples of some testimonials, and I'll share more as they come. But you know, so I think one of the best practices that I can share is always starting heritage language course with the unit on identity, because you probably don't know your students yet, right? So in order to create curriculum or activities where they can see themselves validated, their names, for example, that's so important. You can include it in a unit about identity. And I think Galeria has a section where they talk about apellidos. So that's a really good way to connect apellidos and nombres and how important they are to our identity, right? So I think using testimonio, I shared the definition and I showed you 2 examples. I shared a little bit about mine as a tool to validate your students, could be done in a unit or throughout the year, right? Like every unit could capture a part of their testimonio and it could end up in like this art testimonial artifact portfolio, and I can share a little bit more about that towards the end of the session. But really thinking about how can I slowly get to know my students better, because you can't just ask and demand for them to tell you everything that they've experienced and why they're there if you don't share about your own testimonial, right? So we have to also be able to open up our own papelitos guardados and share who we are, where we come from, in order for our students to also share more about themselves. I hope that makes sense. But for Galeria, which I am not an expert in Galeria, I don't work for Galeria, but these are some of the book that the cohort 1 has been using is Galeria, and I did want to show that the first module is centering identidad and has some essential questions there as well. And I do want to highlight that the first cohort did work hard on like can-do statements, activities that I believe you will have access to. So if you do end up purchasing this book, you do have some resources that will be shared with you as well too on identity. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about this, but also we realized that even jumping into Galeria, right, there needed to be a piece about what does it even mean to be a heritage speaker in Hispanohablante, like what is this class? So we actually created a unit 0, just like we have for our world language classes, like what does it mean to be a language learner? We have a unit 0, which is I think 3 or 4 lessons, or maybe even it could extend to 5 lessons. What does it mean to be a heritage speaker? To talk about all we talked about, the diversity of the Spanish language, of the Mandarin, different dialects of Chinese, things like that. So that's kind of before you even jump into the curriculum. And that's where students' language maps come in, and a lot of these pieces, just getting to know who they are. And it's really exciting. So you are learning from everything we learned during cohort 1 as a pilot with 6 schools, right? So you are learning and receiving some of the resources we created. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So how can you do this? How can you engage students in writing their own testimonials? It's by, through centering our students' linguistic and cultural practices and funds of knowledge in the classroom, right? So how do you do that? I think, like I just said, sharing your own testimonial. Who are you, right? Like little by little, also open up about who you are, where you come from. Even if you're not a heritage speaker or native speaker, like how did you get to the language? Like the students are interested in knowing your stories, right? So like in order to hear their stories, you have to share your story as well too, and figure out how you could do it creatively throughout the school year. If you are familiar with the funds of knowledge, you can just write in the chat, I'm familiar, or yes. This is research that was done in like around 1995 by Luis Moll, who just passed away, Norma Gonzalez, and Kathy Amanti, who was an educator. Norma and Luis were researchers and educational researchers, and Norma, I believe, an anthropologist. But they were working in Arizona, and they were trying to conduct research to figure out or to push back against this idea of students, of specifically Mexican American students at that time and place, pushing back against the idea that students come into the class as empty slates, right? That they come into the classroom with knowledge already. And they conducted home visits to Mexican American households, where they interviewed parents, they interacted with individuals, and they were trying to observe, like they were ethnographers, right? Trying to figure out what was going on and how was learning being occurring in these households. So their research found that families were engaging students in learning, right? They were engaging them in math through different, like if their dad was a construction worker and they were helping their dad paint or measure something, like that is math, right? They were engaging their students in reading through going to church and reading Padre Nuestro, or just engaging in these literacy practices that sometimes in schools we don't consider literacy. We don't think about them as literacy practices, but parents were doing their best to try to help their students learn at home too, right? So their research was proved that there was learning going on in households, and that Mexican parents, and they did care about the education of their students, right? And we're supporting it. So when we think of funds of knowledge, our funds of knowledge are like our lived experiences, our cultural practices, our parents' careers, and how all these different things, holidays, traditions, parenting styles, I don't know, the idea of having that goals, academic goals, career goals, all these different things, the food we eat, religion, values, beliefs, all these different things that make up who we are as individuals, right? We all have funds of knowledge, and they can be used as leverage to learn in the classroom. Our funds of knowledge might be similar or different from our students, so we really have to reflect on that. Our schooling experiences might be similar or different to our students, right? We have to reflect on that too as well. And our language goals might be different or similar to our students, our identities, our family, our upbringing, and our career, right? Like our career goals as well too. So I shared a little bit about my funds of knowledge when I shared my testimony, right, where I grew up. I shared that I travel a lot to Mexico. I definitely still do a lot of the Mexican traditions, even though I'm in the US, right? And for me, for example, I grew up with this idea that you don't question the teacher. That was one of my sort of lived experiences, right? Like it's part of the culture that my mom passed on to me. Like we listen to the teacher, we don't question the teacher. And that, I don't think that helped me with my critical thinking skills, right? Because I always thought like I had to do what the teacher said, until I was later on in college. I was like, no, like I have to really think critically and like and push back sometimes, and like really ask for what I need, right, from the teacher. And that was part of my upbringing, right? So like my teachers thought I was just a quiet student, but in my mind I was asking myself all these questions, but I wasn't getting, like I didn't want to produce them. I don't know if that makes sense. So like there was a lot going on there. And I was never asked, like, what do you think about this? Because I was the quiet, good student, right? So like all these different things, like the way that respect is thought about, it matters in the education of children and your students, right? So thinking about all these different things and how all of your students' funds of knowledge, all these different things you see here, impact how they're gonna act in your classroom, what they're gonna produce in your classroom, what they're gonna bring to your classroom. So just to kind of think about this a little bit further, if we think about the funds of knowledge of our students, we can really use them as leverage to scaffold their learning, right? So how can we use what students already know? So for example, if you think about their Spanish language skills, If they come with Spanish that some people would call like Pueblo Spanish, rural Spanish, right? That's Spanish. That's still a beautiful variety of Spanish. So how can we use that variety to help them acquire academic Spanish? Instead of saying, don't speak that way, how can we say, perfect, you speak Spanish, that's great. Your parents gifted you this language, right? You speak some Mandarin, not judging them. How can we help you get to the next level, right? I think Kim talked about the plants, right? How can we water, like the academic Spanish, or I'm sorry, the Spanish variety they already speak, to help them develop or continue developing their Spanish. So thinking about also the culture, like if students are already reading something at home, like newspapers, how can we use that as leverage to get them to read entire books or novels in Spanish, right? Like they already have some of these skills. So how can we use that as leverage in our classrooms? And I want us to kind of pause a little bit here and I can share the Jamboard here, right, Jill, and they have access to it. And I just want you to really think about your own, let me see, what did I do? Your
I'll
own.
put it in the chat. Yep.
Yeah, if you guys can, I think it's the first slide. And one second. Okay, I lost my camera, but it's the first. If you guys can, let me open it over here.
Frames 1 and it's frames 1, right? Frame
You
1.
can go to frame 1, and if you can, please take a minute or a couple minutes to just think about your own funds of knowledge. And then I'm going to share my screen in a second. I think I got it. Okay. So if you can just write here, like, what are your funds of knowledge, right? Like, if you can share a little bit about that. And are they similar or different from your students? And I want you to think about the students that you're going to probably teach when you teach this heritage class. So think about your school community. And then have you ever done any activities to learn more about your students' funds of knowledge? And Jill, they have access to write, right, on the Jamboard? Okay. So yeah, if you can just think about what are your funds of knowledge? Are they similar to your students? And if you've done any activities, what have you done to capture your students' funds of knowledge or learn more about what they're bringing into the classroom?
You should all have access to edit. So under that arrow on the left, you should be able to add a sticky note. I see one. Thanks.
I think this one, I'm not sure who shared it, but it's so important to consider, right? Because like I'm second generation, so I had to speak to my mom in Spanish because she didn't speak English. So we use only Spanish at home. But my children are third generation, and what's happening to third generation is that they know that we speak English. So then we speak to them in Spanish, and then they respond in English, right? And this is real, right? Like it's something that's happening across the nation. So being aware of that is really, really important as well. And I like the idea of including interviews with family members, because that kind of is going to force students, anything you do at home, right? Like to interview or engage your family, then they have to use the language with the family. So as teachers, you guys are kind of pushing back against this idea of only responding in English and encouraging them to also engage in Spanish conversations with their family members. Mm. It sounds like you guys are doing amazing things already in your classes, so that's really cool. I think maybe like 30 more seconds and then we'll move on. But thank you for sharing and thinking about what your funds of knowledge are and really how they're similar or different from your students and how you can begin to share these lived experiences with your students and start thinking about the similarities that you have with them as well too. And okay, I think because of time, we're gonna move on, but thank you for sharing. And it also gives me an idea of a little bit more about your backgrounds, but also I think it'll be helpful as you start thinking about your own testimonial and your students' testimonials and the crafting of them. These are so interesting. Yeah, and this one's really real because some of you might end up having a class that has half heritage speakers and half native speakers, and that's in theory there should be a different class, right? But sometimes that just doesn't happen, and you will have to do a lot of differentiation there as well too, with those two different student communities.
Yeah, we talked about just how much diversity will even be just in this class where everyone's at least a heritage speaker, but so much diversity in levels.
I'm going to return to the Canva and then we have this for reference regardless when we come back. I think I was. Okay, so then I'm gonna just share really quickly. The links are here to all these activities. So we talked about testimonials, what cultural funds of knowledge are. And you guys all shared some activities that you do with your students already, which are amazing. Here are 3 other activities that you can do. And I apologize, they're in Spanish, but I think that they could apply for a Mandarin class as well too. The first one is a Google survey that's already created, and I believe that I made it an option that you can create a copy and just edit it. But it's a survey asking your students questions about their experiences with Spanish and outside of the of your class, and just trying to gather like data and answer questions so you can kind of get to know them, their linguistic profiles more. This one is a project that's titled Quien Soy Yo, which you can also use like in the first unit if you wanted to, but it's a simple project that you could do the first week of school, where students have to introduce themselves, where their family is from, and like do a little bit of research on their native, like if it's a pueblo or a city, and just kind of share a little bit about who they are to the whole class. And I do it more in the form of a circle, not standing up in front of the whole class, just a little bit more informal. And I require them to only do 4 slides or 5 slides. And the instructions are linked here as well too. And then this last one, I did not create. It was my friend Oscar, who's an educator here in Illinois. And it's just a virtual locker, and students have to decorate it with images based on their identities. So it has instructions there as well. It's linked, and I believe you can make a copy of it as well. And then this last one, my friend Melissa Ponte, who's also a teacher here, did, which is very similar to the locker. Just 10 images, and use 10 images to represent your identity. And then they have to present it to the class as a way for them to get to know each other, but then also helps you get to know each other. What Melissa does with these is that she prints them and she puts them in her classroom, so they're part of like the classroom landscape. And then she can also visualize and see like what her students like, who they, like they are. When you're thinking of bell ringers or anything, like visuals help, right? Or where their students are from as well. Something that I did one year when I was at Bolingbrook was I bought a map and I asked students to put like a little sticker, depending on the country where their parents were from, so they can visualize like where our classroom community came from as well. So that's another thing you can do if you wanted to have that in your classroom, so then you can remember, where are my students from, and really start thinking like, am I talking, for me, for example, I always did way too much Mexican literature and songs and stuff, and it made me really get out of that comfort zone and like, okay, I have Venezuelan students and Colombian students, like I have to also look for music and literature that represents those students, right? Not just my Mexican students because they're 90%, but the other 10% deserve some space in the curriculum as well too. So having visuals helps you really remember who's in your classroom. This is one of my favorite activities that the instructions are also linked here. When you're thinking about funds of knowledge and identity, students engage in creating their own identity boxes. So it was literally like small white boxes, and we brought art into the classroom, right? So we had paint, we had stickers, students brought small objects, and they were asked to use the box to represent their identity. So I told them an option was to use the inside of the box to represent traits that only you or those close to you know about with respect to your identity, and then the outside identity traits that anyone can see. So this specific student had in the outside, she was white passing, so she had the American flag, and the inside she had the Mexican and Salvadorian flag. So she felt like, and she wrote about, they also had to write, it was like one of the components in the instructions is to write the explanation to your identity box, but she felt like when she was outside in her neighborhood, people assumed she was white, but only people that really got close to her and knew her knew that she spoke Spanish, that she was a heritage speaker, and that she had a parent from Mexico and one from El Salvador. So I also didn't know that. I assumed she was also Mexican because her Spanish variety was from Mexico. It sounded more like from Mexico, even though they're very similar. So this even taught me more about her. So using and playing music in the background and just bringing art into the classroom in the beginning of the school year, it just sets a different tone, right? So we did this with our heritage students who were mostly receptive bilinguals in Bolingbrook, and it helped us as educators, once again, to get to know them, but also we put them across the classroom. So once again, we had their own artifacts, and we were able to visualize and remember who our students were. So if you were able to do something like this, I highly encourage it. And once again, the instructions are linked there as well. And when we think about, the students' funds of knowledge, also thinking about the literature, and I brought that up earlier. I was guilty in the beginning of only looking for Mexican or Mexican American literature because the majority of my students were Mexican American. But as I got students from other countries, I started interrogating my curriculum, right? Like, who was being reflected in my curriculum? Is it only Mexican Americans? If I have even one Venezuelan student in my classroom, like there should be something reflected from their culture in my curriculum as well. So these are just some questions for you to start thinking about as you engage in developing this curriculum or even using Galeria, right? How can I supplement what's in Galeria to make sure that all my students see themselves represented in the curriculum? So thinking about who is depicted in the book or the excerpt or the film that I'm showing, are my students seeing themselves reflected in the book? Even thinking about the characters, are the characters bilingual or are they monolingual, right? How will your students connect to this piece of literature, and why is this piece of literature important or meaningful for my students, right? So this is actually an example from Galeria, and I like the way that they do this. It's really hard to read an entire book, and sometimes it could be boring in a class with high school students because sometimes you just don't have enough time. And I like reading excerpts and sometimes even comparing and contrasting with different books. But this is an excerpt from Cuando era puertorriqueña. I don't know if you guys have read this book, but highly recommended, right? Esmeralda Santiago, especially since you're in New York, because it does talk about New York quite a bit, right? But this specific excerpt talks about her experience. It's in Spanish, so you guys, the Spanish speakers, can read it as I try to translate it. But basically, the excerpt is talking about how in her school there are two types of Puerto Ricans, right? The ones who just got to New York or Brooklyn, and the ones that have been in Brooklyn and were born in Brooklyn and their parents were born in Puerto Rico, and like the kind of like the tension between both groups, and how for some, some of these groups, or one of these groups wants to go back to the island. The others just think about it as a place to go on vacation where there's a lot of mosquitoes, and like she just kind of goes into detail. And this is a text that your students could probably relate to or not, and they can talk about and get engaging conversations because it's relatable, right? Especially to the students who are Puerto Rican, but I think to any student, you can just like, how does this, do you think is the same for you, that, for Mexican American students, for Dominican American students, like you can really kind of go and talk about different experiences. And actually cohort 1 created the following activities that I'm sharing. I didn't create them, but I think they did a really good job of thinking about how to connect it to the world now, right? So they thought about retos de los recién llegados. So like, what are some challenges of individuals that are just getting to the US? And I think with the new arrivals from Venezuela, right, it's something that we can talk about, right, and build solidarity in our students as well too, right? Think about why individuals leave their native homes, right? Like people don't want to just walk away from their family and their culture and their countries. Like there's something that pushed them to come, right? But what are some challenges of when individuals get here, and start talking about that? That's one activity that they did here. And the cohort 1 also looked for an interview of Esmeralda Santiago. The students listened to it, and then they had to answer some questions based on the interview. And then lastly, some questions for students to interview each other. I always love doing this in class. The more you can have students interview each other, the better, especially about themes that you're discussing in class. So here they're asking like, you think you would be able to assimilate in a different country where you don't know the language, right? So just questions that are real life and the students can really think about critically and answer. And then when thinking about literature, right, you guys are going to engage in creating those activities as well next year. I would, once again, not necessarily encourage to read an entire novel, but excerpts, right? So like in my case, I have some Puerto Rican students, so I would definitely use Cuando era puertorriqueña, that specific piece. But then I also have Mexican American students, so I would probably use an excerpt from Yo no soy tu perfecta hija mexicana and have them compare and contrast the experiences of the characters, right? Because they're still both talking about identity. I'm not going to have them read both entire books, right? But some students might want to read the entire book, and then you'll encourage them to read the entire book and like take it out from the library, or if you have funds for your own personal library, right? But I did include here a reading list that, let me see if it links, yeah, that I created from books that I've read that I've enjoyed, and I put like themes and like different like sub themes that you can talk about with your students. And I linked I think I linked the Amazon link or something like that. It's been a while, but these are just some books that are in Spanish that you might be able to use in your class if you do have funds for a personal library, or even just share with your students if they want to take them out from the public library, if there aren't funds for a personal library. But they're from different Spanish-speaking countries, but a lot of them are US authors, US Latinx authors, right? Which I think is also really important to highlight. And let me see. So I actually put in the a second Jamboard, and we can go back to it. And I wanted to see if you guys wanted to share, but because of your context right in New York, can you share any other books that you can think about maybe using excerpts for your own students, or have you used any excerpts from books that represent students in New York public schools that will potentially be in those heritage classes? If you can just add the name of just the books, like don't put anything for the movies, just books, any books that you recommend. I think that would be helpful for everyone here to start thinking about what books can I use that are available in Spanish that represent my students. Jill?
To your point, and just thinking about last session when we talked about free voluntary reading and everything, again, like the big idea is getting students to be really excited about reading in that language. But Nancy knows, and we've talked about it, like we've learned from the pilot, right? Galeria has excerpts, and it like from Cuando era puertorriqueña, Cajas de Cartón, and like in those excerpts, students go really deep into like main idea and theme and similes, and like Galeria has done a pretty good job of really representing all the most of the Spanish-speaking countries, and also really digging into excerpts of text. So when two teachers tried to replace with class novels, and it did not go as well. So like, it's great to think about the library, these supplemental texts that would be in your library, but really thinking about fidelity to what Galeria provides. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you can resend the link for the Jamboard.
Yep, absolutely.
But I'll just kind of keep going, and if you guys want to share that, and that's a resource that you guys can have moving forward, right? Like what books can I use? I know I think Joe just put it in the chat, but I also am a huge believer, and this is not something that's on Galeria, because like I said, I don't work for Galeria, but I am a big believer of using movies in the classroom. So I usually show a movie per unit. Full disclosure, like I think it deserves time in the curriculum because students enjoy movies. They're in Spanish, or sometimes they are in Spanglish, but if you can find a movie that connects to the theme that you're teaching about, I think it's always really powerful also. So for example, when I teach about immigration, or when I have taught about immigration, I have shown Which Way Home. When we talk about technology, spare parts, it's a really good movie as well. When I talk about the farm workers union, like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, The Harvest is a really good movie, or the Cesar Chavez or Dolores Huerta movie. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I do want to also share that when you go on the PowerPoint, if you click movies, my friend Oscar, who I presented with at Expo a few years ago, created a movie, sort of movies by themes handout. So you guys have them here as well too, as a resource. So whatever theme you're teaching about, most of these are in Spanish, so they're just there for you as well. And yeah, I don't know if in the Jamboard, if you guys wanted to put other movies, like we have some there as well too. Bajo la misma luna, I love that movie as well. My students loved that movie. El laberinto del fauno. Just think about what movies would engage your students, and what books would engage your students as well. I know Elizabeth Acevedo is also like really popular right now. What other books? Someone just shared Gary Soto. Is another really good one. So I think collectively you guys have so much knowledge already, right? So like, what have we taught that has worked for our students? And if you guys can just continue to share those, that would be wonderful. Okay, so let me move this really quickly. So we talked a lot about cultural funds of knowledge, how we can use different activities, and literature is really important as well, right? For our students to see themselves reflected in the characters. in the language being used, and even like where the setting of the book as well too. But what about their linguistic funds of knowledge, right? We talked about earlier, like we shouldn't correct, someone wrote in the chat, like we shouldn't correct their pronunciation or the Spanish or Mandarin that they bring into the classroom. We should really embrace and build from it, right? So I want us to watch a video, and this never works on my computer, so let's see if it works. If not, I'll send you the link to it. I don't know if you guys have already watched this or not, but we're gonna watch it twice. And if you have a pen and pencil near you, that would be really helpful for the next activity that we're gonna do. But let me see if this plays.
I think you have to stop sharing
Oh,
and
okay.
then you share and you, in the bottom, hold on, in the share screen, the bottom left or something, it says share sound. Oh, yeah. So if you don't know how to do it, I can do it, but yeah, you have to
Can I
click.
send you the link to it?
Yeah, that's fine.
Perfect.
Yeah, okay. Cool.
I've tried in the past and it doesn't work.
Yeah, okay.
So I just shared it. We're gonna watch a short video, and it's gonna help us think about this idea of
Okay, hold on.
linguistic linguistic funds of knowledge, sorry. So you can just watch it this first time.
Okay, hold on.
Mhm.
Okay, share sound and share screen one. Okay, do you see it?
Yeah, it's really small.
Okay, so,
There you go. Yeah, if you can just
okay, hold on. I'm gonna start again. Okay. Do you hear it?
no.
Ugh.
I think it's muted again, yeah. Okay, so now we're gonna watch it again, but this time either in a piece of paper or in the chat if you want. I want you to write down how many different language varieties does, oh my God, I forgot her name. The main character use within this like 40-second video. Like how many times does she use a different language variety? Okay, so write it down. And if you want, you can also try to name the language variety. Like what is it called that she's using? Okay. Oh, it's muted again. Okay, thank you, Jill. So
Sure.
yeah, if you guys can write down in the chat, how many different language varieties does she use? I think her name is Julissa, sorry. 5, okay. Most of you are saying 5. We probably don't have time to name them, but this is what my friend Megan and I came up with, around 4. Some people said 5, but we thought there was some Dominican/US Spanish going on, some neutral like US Spanish, and then some Black English, and then like what we would call like white English or standard English, right? Like but it's amazing how she was able to switch so fast within 40 seconds. So my question is, if she only spoke standard English, would she have been as successful as she was in all those conversations? What do we think about that? Or do we think it was necessary for her to change, to use different variations of Spanish or English? What do we think? You could either unmute yourself or just write in the chat.
I think that her being able to adapt to who she was talking to really allowed her to interact and kind of relate to the person she was talking to. If she just used standard English for all the scenarios, there definitely probably would have been a language barrier for those who only spoke Spanish. And she may have not gotten the reaction that she wanted from some of the people that she was talking to or relating to them how she wanted. Like, you could even tell, like, when she was talking to the Caucasian woman, she was just not as engaged or not as emotional as she was when she was talking to the other people that she had encountered. So like even her passion and her excitement changed depending on the way that she was speaking.
Yeah, thank you. Raquel?
I also think it allowed the people that she was speaking to be natural around her. So they felt comfortable that they can be in the way they responded. When she spoke in this language she felt comfortable with, she used gestures. She used her hands. And it's interesting when she spoke quote unquote white English, she didn't. She was more conservative.
Yeah. Yeah, those are really great observations. Thank you, both of you. And then I think there were Carla and there was someone else.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that allowed her to be her true self, right? Like in all of them, she was being her true self, but just different varieties of herself, I guess, right? And then I think probably instead of calling it white English, maybe more like professional, right? Because I think you would professional English, I guess. American professional, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Oh yeah, it's hard. Like naming languages or varieties can get tricky, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? I think there was one more person that raised their hand. But I don't know if someone else raised their hand. I can't see anymore. But I think this is an activity you can do with your students. You can show them the video and then show them how them being able to use different varieties, whether it's of English, Spanish, or Mandarin, or any language, is actually a strong skill, right? It's not a deficit. Like they should continue to use these different language varieties depending on who they're talking to and their audience, and making space for that in your classroom as well, right? Like for them to think about these different things and not think about it as, oh, you know, Spanglish is bad, like I shouldn't be speaking that. But no, actually Spanglish is not bad, and it's something that you have to have a certain level of proficiency in both languages to be able to produce, right? So like harvesting that is really important. Raquel?
It's interesting because if you think about it, as Spanish teachers, we do it already with tú y usted. So it's so interesting how we teach our kids from day one. For your friends, you talk about tú, but when you're talking to professionals or you're having a professional conversation, it's usted. So we started off with the writing and then we try to apply it to the language, and it's like one is formal, one is informal, and even with verbs that we use like textear, mandar un mensaje. You know, it's so interesting how we're doing it already and we don't realize that the kids are picking up on that.
That's true. Yeah. That's a good way to connect it. So I engage my students. I always show every class, you know, every year, I show them that video, and I engage in conversations with them about that, right? Like, how many different language varieties do you speak? Who do you use them with? And the next activity that we do, that I don't think we're gonna have time to do, but I highly encourage you to think about and to engage with your students. I think this is one of the activities that Joe mentioned that the cohort 1 did last year, but this is an example of a linguistic autobiography that one of my students designed or did well after showing this video. So from seeing Alegria's language closet, what do we know about her just from seeing it? What can you guys infer? Like, who is she? What languages does she speak? And think about her linguistic confidence. What do we know about Alegria just by seeing this visual? What languages does she speak? What languages do we think she feels more confident with? What do we think her major might be, just from looking at this visual linguistic autobiography?
So if you see the different items that she has, I think she prefers English because she has a blonde, beautiful dress. And then she has around that she speaks English with friends, boyfriend, at school, with the family. And at the bottom, I don't know, and for work, I guess. So I guess I don't know if that's her perspective or that's the society's perspective, but you know, since it's like the long, beautiful dress, English is kind of the primary there. And then you see like the small bag. Sorry, I let other people participate.
Okay, thank you. Judy?
Yes, it's not just like how she uses, but it's her vision of what she sees. So she sees English is the most beautiful language, the perfect one. And Spanglish is in the middle. No, it's like fancy, but it's not fancy. And Spanish, she sees Spanish like the service language. It's like, yes, it's like he has like an order hierarchical of the languages. So it's like, oh my God, like it's her vision of how she sees the languages. She sees no the three languages like different, like, but it's like more important. It's how she feels. I mean, I don't know.
Anyone else? Thank you.
No puede ni hablar. Ah, sorry.
Well, I will share.
Karina has her real hand up. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you for letting me know, Karina.
So I actually think that I do see what Yuri is saying, but I also was thinking something different. Like the English is the very formal dress, but it's also the very uncomfortable dress, like the one where you have to be extra formal and extra careful and extra, be on your heels, which is not necessarily, the most comfortable thing. But then when you switch to Spanish, it's like the free one, like where you can move around and you can feel free. And yeah, Spanglish is like the in between both things. So I can see
Both
like
ways.
the two things. Who knows what was in her mind, really.
I could share what was in her mind that she shared with me. So these are all like really cool interpretations, right? So she was a fashion major at a community college that I taught. So that's why she chose. I just gave them the instructions you see here. So like I didn't ask them a specific way to represent their linguistic autobiography. So she decided to use this because she was a fashion major. So I thought it was really, really cool. But she actually shared that this shows like her linguistic confidence in the languages. So with English, she feels like, she feels really strong about her English and like confident about her English. And that's why it's so long. The dress is so long. And then she said with her Spanglish, that's a second, sort of variety or language that she feels a little bit confident with. And that's who she uses it with. And then Spanish is like the one that she loves the language. So there's something there, Karina, where like she loves the language, but she just feels like very linguistically insecure when it comes to Spanish, specifically when she thinks about Spanish class. And then French, she took 2 years of French. But this was really interesting as an educator as well, because Alegría was in a class with predominantly like with heritage speakers who had a really high proficiency. And she was always very, very quiet in class, always on time, but very quiet. And this was one of the first activities we did. And that's when I found out that that's why she was quiet, because she was intimidated, right? Because all her other classmates felt really like, it was like, the English and Spanish almost were the same when you think about linguistic confidence. But for her, that wasn't the case. So it helped me differentiate for her, right? So we had several meetings outside of class to just kind of practice her Spanish and just like encourage her to keep practicing it and just helping her out. But it even helped me understand why she was being so quiet in class, right? So I highly encourage you to to engage your students in visualizing this and showing you and explaining to you in writing as well too, like why they chose the objects they chose to represent the languages that they speak. It's a really, really helpful tool. And I'm just gonna share a few others, and you'll have them as resources as well too, of other students that did this activity. One of them chose like La Loteria. And then you have here like the explanation of why they chose La Loteria. This was like 2 years ago when like Tacuaches and all that, like it's still going on, the Edgars and all that stuff, but when it just came out, right? So someone chose like La Troca and like No Que Maca, and like they just got, it was really interesting, and they explained and wrote about it as well too. But you can even see like a little reflection of their identities as well here too. So I highly encourage you, if you can do something like this in your class, especially in the first unit, it will teach you so much about their linguistic funds of knowledge as well. I don't think we're gonna have time to draw your own linguistic maps, but I highly encourage you to, if you're gonna do this with your students, to do your own and then show it to your students as an example. So then once again, you're like showing them or modeling for them, but also like sharing your own linguistic testimonial with them. This next sort of section, we're getting towards the end, is also making sure that our students not only see that their language varieties are beautiful and powerful and they have meaning and they should use it with different audiences, right? And that's a talent that they can do that, but that linguistic variation is beautiful. I can't remember who shared in the beginning that, you know, their Dominican Spanish was being judged, right? Because it's Dominican Spanish and it's not Spanish from Spain or from another country. And that's real. That happens to our students all the time, right? To individuals all the time. So how can we get them to understand that that's not okay, right? Those are ideologies, and that in our classroom, it's going to be a safe speaking zone where all language varieties are going to have equal linguistic value, right? And we're going to respect all varieties. And I always talk to my students about linguistic variation in English, right? Not only in Spanish, but if you think about the context of the US, how different, even in New York, I mean, like someone said, in different boroughs have different accents. So like, that's a real thing in all languages across all, you know, different continents. So talking to them about that is really important. It deserves some time and space in the classroom. So these are some resources that I've used in my classroom, but these are also some ideas of what you can have in your classroom. So this is a teacher that teaches elementary, but she has these different sort of artifacts in her classroom up in her wall. So her students help create them, and then they can see them as well in the classroom, like part of their linguistic landscape. So just an idea for you guys, especially since you are in New York as well, so you have such like rich linguistic diversity. If you do end up using Galeria, I think it's Módulo Uno. Yeah, Módulo Uno also talks about lexical variation, why it's important for heritage communities, and they specifically focus on the vocab for family. So like la abuela, different ways to say la abuela, el hermano, different ways to talk about campesinos, right? Different words that you can use, and it helps students build their linguistic toolkit as well. So I put the page number there as well for you. And these are really cool. These are some examples from cohort 1. I think it was Rashawn that we said, right, Joe, that did this.
Rashawn.
Do you have more context on like if he asked students, like if his students knew these words or they looked them up, or how they did this activity?
I think they did it just from their brains because there's so much diversity, like different countries and communities represented, even within DR, like different La Campo or one of the larger cities. So I think he did this as part of Unit 0, actually, but Galeria has variaciones léxicas and es bueno saber sections throughout each module to really bring this out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
And this just builds community. Like the students see themselves, and it's great. He's kept them up all year. Some of the other teachers took them down, and I said, like, there's value in students seeing this up all year round, just like to set the community.
So sorry, this is something you can do in your classroom. Like, I don't know if you guys have those giant, also those giants Post-its, and like you can put them around the classroom, and then just that's probably what Rashawn did, and just help see what they already know. And then, yeah, I think it's a good idea what he did to put them up in the classroom so students can also see them as a reminder. this, so one of the teachers that I work with also took it even a step forward, right? When we think about US Spanish or Spanglish, she created a whole unit on US Spanish and Spanglish to also validate that and her students' identities, and also taught them a little bit of grammar as well. So what she did was talk to students about las partes de la oración, so different parts of the sentence. And then, you know, what a verb is, what a noun, adjective, a pronoun, an adverb. And she asked students to create their own word using English and Spanish, so a Spanglish word. I think that, let me see if the other examples are here. I'm not sure if it will open up. No, okay. So these were the instructions she gave her students. So write a sentence using using a word, and then create a word using Spanglish, and then make a drawing. And then this is an example of one of the words. One second. Ronquín, right? So ronquín comes from what two words in English and Spanish? To snore and roncar, right? So ronc, like the stem of the word, comes from the Español, right? Roncar, and then the ing, snoring, comes from English, right? So she showed this example to her students, and then students had to create their own words as well too. And the reason why she did this activity with them is to teach them grammar, right? But also to validate US Spanish or Spanglish, and to show their students that so she shared that and I did it this year with my students, it takes time to come up with the word. It's not that easy. And you have to speak both languages to be able to do it correctly, right? So for example, my kids are, like I shared earlier, they're Mexican, and they play with language a lot. And as a researcher, for me, that's fascinating. But so sometimes I record what they say, but like a couple of weeks ago, they said that they told me like, oh, eso es complicil. And I was like, what's complicil? And they just kept saying the word complicil. I'm like, I don't know what they're saying. And then they told me that they watched a Bluey episode where Bluey created a word with English, and I don't know what language. I think it was Italian. I have no idea. So then they thought, hey, let's create a word with English and Spanish. So they thought about complicil, which comes from complicated and difícil, right? Complicil. And then they told me, tú eres una mamá complicil. And I was just laughing, because they it's just so cool that they feel safe doing that, right? Like, because growing up, my parents didn't necessarily love that we spoke Spanglish, right? They would be like, no, se dice así, because they wanted us to maintain our Spanish. But it was really cool that they thought it was cool to do that, right? So I think it's really important to also make space for that in our classroom. Like, it's okay to speak US, not only say it's okay to speak Spanglish or US Spanish, but to create space in the classroom for them to play with language and also grade these activities, right? And just even what my friend did was the word that gets the most votes wins, and we get to use it the remainder of the school year. So like, just helping students continue to develop this idea of being language architects, right? They can create words and play with words as well. So I will kind of transition to saying, like, you know, we talked about we read a little bit of some testimonios, right? And we talked about the importance of cultural and linguistic funds of knowledge. And through you know, a unit or the year, you can start capturing your students' testimonials through art, right? So through art, through poems, through writing, and then they can have like sort of like a portfolio that is really kind of telling their stories, right? Their testimonials, who they are, their language experiences, but also their language goals, and moving forward, how they want to use language. So as I shared earlier, testimonials are personal and an intimate experience. Students, as they go through the year, they will share more about their papelitos guardados, right? Their experiences that they lived with you, because they'll build trust. They'll get to know you. You'll get to share your testimonial with them. But I think it's really important to also be vulnerable and share our own experiences. So you guys shared in the Jamboard some of your funds of knowledge, right? Some of you guys said that you got here when you were 18 and you had to learn English here. So how was that experience? Was it easy? Was it hard? I think that's something that you can share with your students, and then they can compare it to their experiences with Spanish, right? Is it easy or hard to not have access to a Spanish class until you're in high school, and then be expected to speak standard Spanish? Like, is that easy or hard? Were you corrected when you spoke English with an accent? Are they corrected because they speak Spanish with an accent? Like, talk about accents, talk about all these things. And I think as you engage them in the process, as you share your testimonial and engage them in the process of sharing their testimonial, it could be through different activities. So One of the activities I shared earlier was the identity box, right? That's one of them. The linguistic map, that where they like talk about their different linguistic varieties, who they speak it with. But also some of the activities that cohort 1 has done is like writing poems. So like yo soy poems or identity poems. And I think Joe, you might have, do you have examples of those? If not, I have examples that I can link. But identity poems, so like I shared the identity box, the linguistic map, but the culminating project for me is I asked my students to have all those artifacts and also write their own linguistic testimonial. So like towards the end of whether it's the unit or the school year, they actually have to write an essay. So I like to do it when they have had time already to write a paragraph or write 2 paragraphs, and I've given them feedback and they feel strong about their writing abilities. And I included the instructions here for the testimonio, but for the first part, they actually write the actual testimony, and the second part is a visual. So they have to create a PowerPoint with visuals and they present it to the class. So they don't have to read the testimonial to the class. They just present it, and then I'm the only person that reads it. I do allow them to read it, to use Spanglish, because it's a unit about identity, and I also give it its place. However, this year, out of my 16 students, only 2 use Spanglish because they wanted to push themselves to use academic Spanish. So I gave them the liberty to do whichever they wanted, but they said, no, I want to practice how I would say it in Spanish. So I think just creating those safe spaces might even encourage them to stick to practicing their academic Spanish, right? So these are the instructions for students. I just asked them to write an essay. And here I gave them some ideas of what they could write in each paragraph, but it's really things that we've talked about throughout the school year. So like, who are you? Where is your family from? And do you identify with the place of origin from your families? What languages do you speak? Who do you use them with? Do they form part of your identity? And then I asked them to think about like where their parents are from. Have they traveled there? Do they have a special connection? And then the next one is think about the U.S. Do you think that that our educational system does a good job at portraying bilingualism, multilingualism? How are your experiences in elementary school, and if you were in bilingual classrooms? And then there are more questions there as well to kind of get them to think about their language experiences across the educational pipeline, and once again, their future goals with respect to language, right? And what they want to see change in society with respect to language. So those are linked there for you as well. And then something that we also, and this is just an example of one of my students, what she wrote. And for this specific testimonial project, we did it at the end of the unit, not the end of the school year. So after like 6 weeks, this is what she wrote. I'm going to read it in Spanish, but you can see the English translation here, just so you can see like how much students can open up after you talk to them and kind of scaffold this project. So she wrote, pero no era hasta la prepa que tenía problemas sobre mi identidad. Cuando era más chiquita sí tenía problemas porque yo tenía un acento, porque aprendí español primero y los niños se reían de mí y me hizo odiar México un poquito. Pero era peor en la prepa porque eran 90% güeros. En casi todas las clases que yo tenía, yo era la única de color y la única mexicana. Yo nado, es un deporte very white y casi no hay mexicanos, pero esa era mi experiencia en los equipos que he estado. Cuando era español, cuando entré a la escuela, obviamente empecé a hablar más inglés y no más español en la casa, pero cada año con que crecí, se me perdió un poquito el español porque no estaba en la casa por mucho tiempo, siempre estaba haciendo deportes o en la escuela. Y ahorita mi español es más o menos, a veces mi primo se ríe de mí porque mi acento es un poquito chistoso. Pues sí me da vergüenza, pero todavía ahorita tengo mucho orgullo en mí misma que puedo hablar 2 idiomas. Pero en la prepa sí me dio mucho trabajo amarme a mí misma porque todos siempre quisieron una rubia con quien más blanquito era. Yo nunca sentí como que I was an outsider. Yo nunca sentí que I was an outsider. I didn't feel like I was wanted or needed. Entonces aquí pueden ver un poquito, ¿no? De you can see, sorry, I'm gonna switch back to English now. You can see like that she's sharing, there's a lot to unpack there, right? And as an educator, if I go in there and just check off her grammar, right? Like, oh, you wrote this wrong, you wrote this wrong. That's not what I wanted from this, but I wanted to kind of hear her testimonial, hear her story. And then this is gonna help me build activities and curriculum that can respond to this throughout the rest of the school year, right? So, I think that we are recording this, right, Joe? Sorry. So I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments about this project or just this quote about this specific student, but you can kind of learn a lot from this person just from this specific paragraph, right? And this is a college student that wrote this, just for some context. Any questions or comments up to here? And then I know I have a few minutes, but just to kind of wrap up, something that I also do, because testimonials to me is not just that, that unit and that project. Also for me, it's like a way of doing pedagogy, right? So towards the entire year, how can we collect stories? How can we center our communities? So something that I do with my students as well is an oral history project in the second unit. So then we talk about immigration. And we talk about the bracero movement, and we talk about how important it is to capture the stories of our own families. So I asked them to interview like the oldest person in their family and just learn about their story and then write about their story. And if you're interested in doing something similar to that, I also included the instructions here. They're in Spanish as well, and with some questions that I use in a rubric. And this has been probably one of their favorite projects because they hear, for a lot of them, it's the first time that they hear the immigration story, that like the story of their parents crossing the border. Basically, I have a lot of Mexican American students, so it's the first time that they actually listen to the story. And a lot of them write about how much more they even respect their parents now, right? Knowing everything they went through and like just thinking about putting themselves in the position of their parents, leaving their native tongue without speaking the language. And I think it really helps, once again, not only capture the stories, but it kind of forces students to use Spanish in a natural setting, right? Like they're interviewing someone in their family, and then they have to listen to themselves, listen to the interview and then write about it as well too. And what I do with those interviews is at NIU, we have an oral history project. So our students deposit their interviews there. And I'm not too familiar with Centro at Hunter College at CUNY, but they also have a similar depository as well. So you guys can probably see if there's any way that you guys can also deposit those oral histories there as well too, and they could become part of the history, history as well. So I always tell my students, if we don't document this history, other generations are going to have access to it, right? So there has to be other moments in history that haven't been necessarily recorded in New York history, especially like when you think about the Bronx or Brooklyn. So I think that will be another really cool project you guys could do with your students, where they can see themselves as historians as well too, and position their family members or community members as individuals with knowledge because they are. And something that I share with my students is that when I did my when I started doing oral history projects, I did them because I learned about my grandpa being a bracero in an informal conversation that I had with him when I was sharing with him that I was going to teach my students about it. And then he told me he was a bracero and started telling me his whole story. And then I regret not recording it, right? Because he passed away and like I wasn't able to record that history, but he shared so much history about that time. And I told them, like it's really important to document that, because once again, if we don't document it, who will, right? And then you can use those oral history, in your own classroom as teaching resources the following year, right? Like, so a student that graduated last year recorded this oral history, so we're gonna listen to it and do an activity with it, and then you're gonna do your own. So I think it's just beautiful to use our community as a source of knowledge, and just our classroom community and outside of our classroom community as well, and use those as teaching resources. So here is once again sort of the different testimonial artifacts that you can collect if you want to engage in this project with your students. So starting off small, right, like with an identity poem, an identity box, the linguistic map, maybe collecting an oral history, and then at the end or in the beginning, you know, whenever you decide that they're ready, actually writing their own testimonial and presenting it to the class. So this is what I have, and I did want to end by sharing some resources, right? I know that a lot of you guys are just starting or have been doing this for maybe a couple of years, but I think it's an exciting time to be a heritage language educator because there are more resources now and more communities, and with Zoom, there's a lot of possibilities to have access to PD and open resources as well. So I just linked some organizations that you can explore. So like the University of Texas, I think you should be able to click on the images. It takes you to like open resources that they have, like free units that they've created. There's a Facebook group, if you're not a part of the Facebook group already, for heritage language teachers, where you can get a lot of access to curriculum as well, or just answers to your questions. And then this is a new organization that it's made up of a lot of heritage language directors at the college level, but they're trying to bring high school teachers as well to be part of the group, and they do like monthly Zoom PDs, and they're free as well, so you guys can also check that out. And then of course you have like Expo that is coming up in November. And then I know this is really far from you guys, but in Illinois we usually have a yearly heritage language conference, and this was the theme for this year. And those are recorded, so I can also send the recordings. I know most of you probably won't be able to make it to Chicago, but there are a lot of resources out there. And if you have a specific unit or question in mind, just let me know, and I can direct you at least to the resources or try to answer some of your questions. But that's all I have. And I don't know if anyone has any questions, comments. I think we have a few minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy, for all you've shared and all the very concrete examples. And again, we'll continue to click on those resources, and I'll make sure they have a clickable version. The one I opened it in incognito and it wasn't clickable, so we'll figure that out. Questions, preguntitas? So, okay, so let me kind of go to close, and then, okay, we'll share. Okay. Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Always fun. So based on everything she said, and again, like we've learned so much from this first cohort. So I wanted to really build out, right? So this is what we've learned from cohort 1, right? So it's 6 schools, it's 2 middle schools, 3 6 to 12 schools, and then 1 high school that opened programs this year. And so last summer, again, we came together and we planned Unit 0, and then we unpacked this purple book and really looked through. And what we noticed is that students engage with the concepts of identity through text and resources, right? So like they are not removed from like everyday learning. So by the end of this year, the students who have been in this first year of Heritage Spanish have quite a few components. So during Unit 0 and the beginning of the year in September, they created language maps. And I will put in the folder some more examples. I loved Nancy's ejemplo de alegría, which was visual, right? Visual. And then I have a template, and this is kind of one student's representation of how he uses different languages, different varieties he speaks, and with whom, his different communities he's part of. There's a template if you want to have students create something like this, but I love the visual piece where they, represent in different ways. That is all like in September. And then module 1, for example, is Nuestra herencia or mi herencia, nuestra identidad, so our identity. And so in there, there's a wonderful poem about apellidos, right? Last names. So then students do a short writing piece about their own last name. Is it hyphenated? Does it fit within ATS, right? Like, is your name cut off in our DOE systems? Like, what does that feel like when your full name isn't even there, right? So that was powerful for students. This is by October. And then they're working towards a lyric poem, all around identity. We added in the Yo Soy poem because that felt very accessible for students. And then module 2, which was kind of in the winter, they were doing an oral presentation on their herencia, their heritage. They wrote a relato, short autobiographical piece. And throughout this, there are a lot of expressive interpersonal tasks that ask students to interview their family members, interview their community. Module 3 is about public health, but actually students are thinking about their own communities, who's in their community, which countries are represented in their community. Does that affect the resources they get? It's just these testimonios pieces and little that's leading up to their portfolios are embedded throughout, so it doesn't feel like separate. Today we're going to do our testimonials. It's actually part of the text they're reading, and they respond that way. So I saw a few questions in the chat about Galeria. I'm going to set up time with Vista Higher Learning to kind of walk you through it. Again, that is available in Shop DOE, and we will have planning time this summer on that. And again, MS 158 colleagues, let's set up a time. And the thing is, so it's 3:51, just looking ahead, right? I will continue to work with Nancy and make sure you have good examples from cohort 1. We've learned a lot that will only help you. So Nancy has coaching available. I will make sure you have links to these slides. Actually, I'll put it in the chat now and send it tomorrow morning. And so you'll be able to sign up for coaching. There's different sessions. There's some sessions tomorrow. There are 30-minute sessions, right, Nancy?
Yeah.
Yep, they pick time, and then she'll invite me. I hope I can join too, but it's a chance for you to say, okay, this is what's happening at our school. We're a small school. And I saw one question about being a small school. This is what we're thinking. These are who we're thinking, right? And so she'll help you figure out what makes sense for your context. And then I invite you to go back to the Jamboard. Any more questions, ongoing questions in the parking lot? That's where the small school question came up. And questions you have here. I encourage you to continue to add there. And exit ticket. So I will put a link to these slides in the chat so you can click on all these links. We will make sure you have access to Nancy's slides in a way that you can click on all the amazing resources. And then from last time, Kim gave us PDFs of actually 4 or 5 textbooks. So I'm going to, in our folder, make sure that in this May, June folder, we have one doc with all the links to things in case the links don't work otherwise, right? We can do a book study next year. It'll be great. So I'll put these in the chat. And so if you go to that final slide, it has the link. And again, I'll send it in an email. But the final slide has the link to the coaching with Nancy, the samples of Rashawn's Variaciones Lexicas from his room, and then the attendance exit ticket for CTLE. Okay, all on slide 7. So we want to thank Nancy for all her expertise and really practical examples, and remind you that next week, our last session, sorry, this is so small, our last session will be on Wednesday, June 5th, next week. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we can stay for a few more minutes. Not everyone's camera's on, but I'd like to get a picture of this group. I know we have another session next week, but should we get a picture? Let's get a picture. Okay, hold on. Okay, please turn your cameras on. Oh my gosh, all those beautiful faces. Tammy, are you actually in San Francisco? No. No. Okay, cool. I am actually in a blurred background. Okay, cool. Hi. And I think we all fit on one screen because I have a very large screen right now. Okay, I'm going to take it. Okay. So I'm going to count down from, what should we count down in? I'll count down in Japanese. San, ni, ichi. Okay, ready? San, ni, ichi, zero, smile, cheese it. Okay. Look at those beautiful smiles. Okay, cool. I'll put it in the chat. I think I can do that. And I'll put it on our last slide. Look how amazing we are. Okay, cool. Thank you for everything. Yan Yan and colleagues, let's set up a time, maybe Monday or Tuesday. Can you send a few times that work, Monday or Tuesday, to talk through the Mandarin piece? Okay, awesome. Thanks. Okay.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much, Nancy.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
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 Yan Yan, are you talking? I see your mouth moving, but I can't hear you.
Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carla.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
perfect.
Okay, great. So for the time next week, what would be the hours like during school hour?
Sorry, so I wonder if it just makes sense to set up time in one of those coaching times Nancy has available. Does that sound right? So maybe take that back to your team, and she put the link in the chat to the Heritage Coaching.
Uh-huh.
And then pick a time, talk to your team. There are times during like the school day, and maybe a time that we can all hop on Zoom and talk through everything. Do you
Okay,
think?
sure.
I'll put it in the chat now.
Oh, yeah, I have it.
Okay.
Do we have to do it on Monday or Tuesday, or is there any other day over the week?
Yeah, I think any other day over the week's fine. That's at Nancy's schedule. I just wondered if it would make sense to connect before our Wednesday session. You decide, whatever works best for your team.
Okay, I'll send out a group email to our team and to see when would be the best time for us to meet together with Nancy.
Okay. And can you remind us right now or put in the chat what you're currently using for your Mandarin classes?
Oh, the textbooks?
Yeah.
I use textbooks. I
Okay.
put different kinds of resources together.
Right. And I think that's what it'll look like for Heritage, probably.
Yeah, I think so. That would be. But I do plan to try to use some textbooks. That's called Go Far. I didn't really start it yet, but for now, the resources that I use is really from all different everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Go Far with Chinese, right?
Yes.
Yep. I'm trying to learn Mandarin. That is my goal. I'm hoping by like the end of the summer, I have more of a, I mean, we're going to get more Mandarin programs in the city, especially with a shortage of Spanish teachers. It's been fascinating. HR is recommending Mandarin teachers to schools that are like 90% Latine, but they can't find Spanish teachers. It's so fascinating. And personally, I'd like to speak it. And I have the foundation in Japanese. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know. Do you know if there's any other school that's already have a heritage program for Chinese?
So heritage programs, not that I know of. There are Chinese bilingual programs, so they have home language arts. So I think that's a connection we should make, Nancy. I didn't even think of that before now. But like any school that has a Chinese bilingual program would have a home language arts course, a Chinese language arts course. And actually, I'm just realizing Are you familiar with the periodic assessments? That there is a Chinese language arts periodic assessment, which actually you could probably, hold on, I'm gonna share it now. I could probably help you get samples of these assessments. I'm gonna share my screen. Are you familiar with periodic assessment? Okay.
Not
So, oh, wait, I'll stop recording, sorry.